If not for his magically enhanced constitution, Krivax was certain that he would have collapsed in relief the moment Project Sanctum appeared above Laudermere Lake. He still had a few tricks up his sleeves toward the end of the battle, such a potent spell that he'd been developing for a very long time to counter the scourge, but things hadn't been looking good. Krivax almost wished that he'd been given the luxury of falling unconscious for a few hours after Tichondrius disappeared, but the battle was still far from over. Krivax was pulled from his thoughts as Masruk landed by his side and began looking him over for injuries with a worried expression. "Don't worry, I'm all right," Krivax was quick to reassure his friend as he began healing a wound in his abdomen left behind by one of the Feelhounds. "The Dreadlord left before his demons could overwhelm us. What about you? Any wounds?" Krivax had sent Masrukov to go find Fordring and had lost track of him in the frenzy of the battlefield. With so many demons and undead running completely rampant throughout Dalaran, there was no telling who would survive each clash. He looked over Masruk and was relieved to see that he only had a few non-lethal injuries across his carapace. "I'm fine as well," Masruk confirmed before glancing toward the awe-inspiring sight currently taking place in Laudermere Lake. "I had just found Fordring when that thing was teleported to the battlefield. He was directed to participate in the main assault on the Scourge's forces." Krivax looked toward the giant necropolis currently flying over Shenzhen Su, a constant stream of Alliance forces slowly descending from its lowest platforms. Since the necropolis was connected to the Azrael-Nerub portal network, ADF troops could be transported easily onto it and then dropped directly onto the turtle. He could tell that the Alliance were likely starting with their most powerful combatants to secure a foothold, as dozens of Spiderlords floated down at the same time. Azrael-Nerub was clearly taking the threat of the Lich King seriously and was bringing its full military might to bear. It was truly a sight to behold, and Krivax felt a mix of awe and anticipation at the sheer scale of the operation. "It is certainly quite impressive," said Vizier Hadix, idly cradling a broken arm as he walked over to their side. "I'd heard rumors, but I hadn't believed that the Circle of Viziers was capable of constructing something like that." Krivax said nothing as he moved to heal his mentor's injuries, knowing for a fact that Azrael-Nerub wouldn't have been able to create Naxxkithel, its flying necropolis, without the assistance of outsiders. During the original timeline, flying necropolis were one of the most distinctive features of the Scourge and were frequently used by them as mobile fortresses to launch attacks across Azeroth. Since he knew something like that was technically possible, Krivax had proposed the idea to the Circle of Viziers. Some of the Viziers had seemed relatively interested, but the vast amounts of resources and experimental magic needed to make it happen meant that getting approval for it was a long shot. At least, it would have been before the Second War when Azrael-Nerub had its foundations shaken by learning of the many threats that existed out there in the world. Instead, High King Anubarak made creating Naxxkithel one of Azrael-Nerub's priorities in the form of Project Sanctum. After all, possessing a flying fortress with its own portal infrastructure capable of deploying large numbers of troops and holding enough munitions to level a city was an attractive prospect. However, the kinds of magic needed to create such a structure was obviously beyond Azrael-Nerub's reach, or they would have already created similar flying buildings before. It was only thanks to the kingdom's contact with the surface races that it was able to gain the knowledge necessary to make it happen. Well, that and Krivax occasionally dropping hints to Malygos about how useful Project Sanctum could be for Azeroth's defense. A quiet revolution in Azrael-Nerub's understanding of magic was taking place thanks to collaboration with Udaman, the Blue Dragonflight, and the Dreenii, which allowed them to create such a monumental structure. They hadn't quite been prepared to teleport the thing all the way to the Eastern Kingdoms, but the emergency assistance of Medivh and several members of the Blue Dragonflight allowed Azrael-Nerub to accomplish something it wouldn't have otherwise. Moments like these were when the power of the Alliance shined the most. Quick organization and leveraging talents from a wide variety of sources was what allowed them to turn the tables against the Lich King and put them in a position to counterattack. It was an emotional moment for Krivax, seeing all of his efforts to prepare Azrael-Nerub against the Lich King finally culminating in the awe-inspiring flying necropolis. Still, the Scourge is far from defeated, Vizier Haedix continued as he looked toward Shenzin Su with a scrutinizing gaze. If the Alliance is not careful, they risk having this counterattack turned against them in a devastating fashion. Krivax let out a sigh, wishing he could just enjoy the thought of the Alliance securing a decisive victory against the Lich King that didn't threaten to be lost at a moment's notice. Unfortunately, he had naively decided that becoming a leader was a good idea, which meant he needed to look at the big picture. "Why is that, Vizier Haedix?" asked Krivax as he finished healing his mentor and began attending to the many other injured left behind after Tichondrius retreated. The Scourge had caused far more devastation to Dalaran than he had initially realized. It was only now after taking in his surroundings that he saw the true extent of the damage. Buildings were reduced to complete rubble and the streets were littered with the corpses of the Scourge and Alliance as the remnants of dark magic lingered in the air like a malevolent fog. If he had to guess, Krivax would estimate that at least a third of Dalaran had been destroyed or severely damaged during the Scourge's invasion of the city. It would take significant efforts to rebuild Dalaran to a point that it was safe for civilians to live in it again. If the creature manages to escape below the waters, then it will be nearly impossible to attack it in any meaningful manner, Vizier Haedix explained, his eyes still fixated on the battle. The Alliance holds the advantage in the aerial theater, but the Scourge holds absolute supremacy underwater. Every combatant on its shell risks being washed away and torn to pieces by undead if Keeper Archidas loses control over it. Krivax turned his attention back to Laudermere Lake, more worried now than he was before. It wasn't difficult to imagine the scenario that Vizier Haedix had described. Keeper Archidas was doing a good job of restraining the massive turtle with his absurdly powerful earth manipulation to keep the creature above the lake's surface. Alliance mages aboard Naxxkithel were assisting as well by using their magic to create barriers around Shenzin Su's limbs, significantly limiting its range of movement. However, Shenzin Su was an undead with inexhaustible stamina capable of continuing its struggles until it inevitably broke free. The Alliance was risking a lot because this was likely the greatest opportunity they would ever have to end the Lich King for good. But it was also placing its most powerful assets at risk with this operation. Both Prophet Velen and Keeper Archidas were fighting atop the massive turtle's shell, along with many other irreplaceable individuals. If they were lost, then the consequences would be absolutely devastating. "Do you know what the Alliance's strategists could be planning?" Krivax asked, hoping the much more experienced Vizier might have an idea. He hadn't exactly had enough time to ask the High King when asking for Project Sanctum to be deployed. However, somebody else decided to answer before the Vizier had the opportunity. "Headquarters intends to slay the creature using a ritual created by Archmage Kel'Thuzad," said Magister Romarth, walking over rubble and destroyed undead as he joined them. The normally well-groomed elf looked weary, his expensive robes torn and signed from the fierce battle. The Alliance Defense Force was contacted via scrying with the details of the assault. "Your assistance has been requested." Krivax let out a sigh of relief, glad to see Magister Romarth. Given how chaotic Dalaran was at the moment, it would have taken a significant amount of time to get in contact with anyone who knew what was going on. "Good to see you, Romarth," Krivax said with a nod of acknowledgement before straightening and focusing on the matter at hand. "Tell me what I need to know." Krivax listened closely as Romarth explained the Alliance's current strategy in great detail. The Alliance had apparently decided to drop their troops in close proximity to what the Pandaren survivors referred to as the Temple of Five Dawns. Aside from the area around the Lich King, it was the second most heavily defended location on Shenzin Su and would serve as a perfect staging ground for the Alliance if they could take control over it. In addition, its position in the very center of Shenzin Su made it a good location to perform a ritual designed to end its undeath. Krivax couldn't help but feel sorry for the ancient turtle and asked why Archmage Kel'Thuzad couldn't simply use more of his anti-undead alchemical concoction to free it of the Lich King's control. Apparently, doing so would be near impossible due to Gul'dan's proximity to the poor creature. Freeing Shen Zin-Su wasn't an option until the Lich King was put down for good, which would take far longer than they could afford to keep the turtle alive. It was unfortunate, but Krivax recognized that there was little to be done about the matter and accepted it. Krivax initially thought that Alliance wanted the ADF to help them secure the Temple of Five Dawns, but headquarters seemed fairly confident in their ability to seize the structure given enough time. Given that they were being aided by Prophet Velen, who was likely the most powerful light wielder on Azeroth, Keeper Arkidas, and every Archmage in Dalaran, that confidence was likely warranted. Instead, the Alliance's strategists wanted the ADF to help secure them time to capture the Temple of Five Dawns by destroying one of the turtle's limbs and reducing its mobility. The longer it took for Shen Zin-Su to break free of its restraints, the better chance the Alliance had in securing the temple and slaying Shen Zin-Su. That sounds like a good plan, if not for the countless undead covering every inch of Shen Zin-Su, Krivax said with a trace of exasperation once Romarth finished speaking. Does the Alliance have any suggestions on how I'm supposed to not only reach the limb, but also destroy it? The Blue Dragonflight can offer a few mana bombs, but nothing nearly as strong as the one used during the capture of Mal'Ganis, Romarth admitted after a moment of hesitation, frustration flashing through his eyes. To be completely honest, I had the impression that they were hoping you may have an idea that they hadn't considered. All of this was hardly something planned in advance, after all. Krivax had to admit that was true. The Scourge's attack on Dalaran was a complete surprise, which meant that this counterattack was a hastily made plan put together at the last moment. Even if it was a plan thought up by the Alliance's best strategic minds, led by Supreme Commander Lothar, Ranger General Windrunner, and High King Anubarak, there were bound to be gaps and uncertainties. Frankly, it was a miracle that things had already gone as well as they had. Krivax did his best to consider the matter with a critical mind, trying to find the best way to use the ADF's resources. If he wanted to put together a strike team to destroy the limb, there were relatively few people who he could count on gathering. While the ADF could call on powerful individuals to fight, certain members like Archmage Kel'Thuzad had superseding responsibilities to other organizations that took precedence. It shouldn't be too difficult to recruit Illidan and Vizier Hadix, Krivax thought as he glanced toward his mentor. Masruk and Team Ronin aren't as powerful, but every bit of help is welcome. Given the importance of the mission, I should also be able to gain the assistance of Archmage Crossus and Fordring despite their current commitments. But will that be enough? This wasn't like their mission to capture Mal'Ganis, which had been a meticulously planned surprise attack involving several artifacts handcrafted by Malygos and Arkidas themselves. This was a frantic and spontaneous operation into the territory of an enemy who was on high alert and would almost certainly see them coming. After thinking on the matter for several moments, Krivax suddenly remembered one person who he hadn't considered before who could be extremely helpful. Romarth, what did you do with the non-hostile undead in the Violet Hold after that initial assault by Gul'dan? Krivax asked, recalling the death monk who had been possessed by the Lich King. He doubted someone as egotistical as Gul'dan would use anything less than the most powerful undead he could get his hands on as a vessel. That being the case, the undead would almost certainly have been a high-ranking member of the Scourge who knew many of their secrets. If Krivax was lucky, then they may have even been one of the original monks killed on the Wandering Isle. We weren't certain of its trustworthiness and had it imprisoned, Romarth said, gaze becoming shrewd as he realized how useful the undead could be. Do you wish to gather information from it? I should be able to have one of Quel'Thala's Magisters skilled in mind magic here quickly. Romarth's ruthlessness in this matter didn't surprise Krivax at all. Much like Illidan had been when he first saw Shangzai, Romarth acted with immediate hostility. The people of Azeroth didn't have good experiences with intelligent undead, the majority having been created by renegade necromancers. In addition, undeath had a well-documented tendency to cause a dulling of emotion and sociopathic behavior. Shangzai had seemed surprisingly composed for the short moments Krivax had spoken with him, even more so than he would have expected given his knowledge of non-hostile undead in the original timeline. No, That won't be necessary. I'll go and speak to the undead myself, Krivax said firmly, making his decision. While I'm gone, tell the Alliance that we'll need a way to travel to Shenzhen-su. Given that Naxxtgethel can't be repositioned without endangering the current offensive and there's no way to teleport there directly, we'll likely need travel by flight. It was fortunate that the Alliance held aerial superiority. Otherwise, it would likely be impossible to reach their destination without first fighting through an army of undead. Romoth looked skeptical, but understood that there wasn't enough time to second-guess him and immediately set out to follow his instructions. Before long, messages had been sent to the Alliance headquarters via magic, and Masruk flew off to gather everyone who would be participating in their attack. Meanwhile, Krivax made his way to the Violet Hold where Shangzai was being held. The prison's security had been taken over by the Alliance's army due to the emergency situation, though there were still many corpses left behind by the Lich King's attack. Nobody attempted to stop Krivax, recognizing his distinctive appearance and the urgency with which he moved through the streets. He made his way to the lower levels of the Violet Hold where Shangzai had apparently been imprisoned. Romoth claimed that the guards he sent found the undead exactly where Krivax had left them, listless and surprisingly compliant. When Krivax finally reached the cell where Shangzai was confined, he found the undead monk peacefully sitting in a meditative pose, his eyes closed and his breathing steady. The stillness in the cell was a stark contrast to the sheer chaos that reigned outside and wasn't at all what Krivax had been expecting. Even if he knew that not all undead were necessarily hostile or malevolent, he'd still thought that someone who had only just been freed from what must certainly have been cruel slavery would be much less calm. Krivax cleared his throat awkwardly to get the monk's attention. "Hello, your name is Shangzai, correct?" Krivax said once the undead opened his eyes glowing with blue light. "I apologize for your temporary imprisonment, but I didn't have enough time to explain that you were no longer under the Lich King's control when I left." Shangzai studied him calmly for several moments before responding. "Temporary? I hadn't believed that I would leave this cell for anything less than my destruction. Is that not the case?" Krivax couldn't hold back his wince, realizing he'd left someone with a very understandable misconception that they would be executed. "So long as you don't harm any innocents, you won't be judged for any actions forced on you by magical compulsion," said Krivax, promising to himself that he would do everything in his power to ensure that was the case once this was all over. "But for now, there are more important things that we need to worry about. We need your help to destroy the Lich King." Krivax went on to explain their current circumstances, along with their mission to cripple Shenzhen-su. A small part of him expected Shangzai to be more reluctant to help, either due to fear or distrust. However, the monk surprised him by agreeing to aid him immediately and without the slightest reservations. "The Lich King arrived in my home and visited evils unto my people more horrific than I could have ever imagined," said Shangzai, a trace of emotion entering his voice for the first time as the glow of his eyes brightened with fury. "I will do everything in my power to see him end, along with the demons controlling him." Krivax was glad to hear that since they needed all the help they could get. Still, he had a responsibility as the mission leader to verify Shangzai's intentions, given that the outcome of this mission could determine the fates of countless people. "You said that the Lich King landed on your home, which means you are one of the monks who lived on Shenzhen-su," said Krivax, studying the monk's every expression. "You realize that we intend to kill the creature, right? Do you really not have any reservations about that?" Shangzai was likely one of the first undead who had fallen under the Lich King's influence, which meant he had plenty of time to be corrupted regardless of how kind he may have once been. Despite this, Krivax could see nothing but melancholy and acceptance in Shangzai's expression as he answered. "Shenzhen-su selflessly gifted my people with shelter and protection for centuries," said Shangzai, his voice quiet and solemn. "He did this for no other reason but out of kindness. Never in my life have I met a more generous person. I know without a doubt that he would have abhorred the evils which the Lich King has forced him to commit and would wish to be stopped by any means necessary." Krivax listened silently as Shangzai explained his perspective, feeling a wave of sadness for the tragedy that the undead described. "It is for this reason why I am so determined to see the Lich King ended," Shangzai continued, the sorrow in his voice being overtaken by determination. "He cannot be allowed to escape to gather his power for years, as those clever demons hide him away in some forgotten corner of the world. Too much suffering has come of him already, and I cannot imagine how much more he will cause if left unchecked." As Krivax studied the monk and listened to the pain behind his words, he concluded that Shangzai was being completely honest. While there was a distinct thread of hatred in the undead's voice, it was clearly born from a deep sense of loss and a desire for justice rather than any malevolent motivation. For a moment, Krivax couldn't help but think that Shangzai would make for a great leader for any other undead who managed to be freed from the Lich King's control, but that was a problem for later. There was little time to dwell on future possibilities when the immediate threat of the scourge demanded their full attention. "Thank you for your willingness to help, Shangzai. I'm sure your knowledge of the scourge and Shenzhen Su will prove invaluable for this mission," Krivax said genuinely before leaving to retrieve one of the Violet Hole's guards. Krivax had to leverage his authority to convince them to dispel the magical barrier imprisoning Shangzai, but they eventually reluctantly agreed after he finished explaining the urgency of the matter. The undead monk received many distrustful glares and guarded looks as he and Krivax made their way out of the Violet Hold, but Shangzai didn't seem to pay it any mind. Eventually, they arrived at a clearing in the northern part of Dalaran, which had been one of the large marketplaces before the attack, where Krivax had instructed Romarth to bring the rest of the team. It seemed that the Alliance had successfully organized transportation, as several griffins were being hastily prepared by soldiers for their journey. Archmage Crossus and Kulkos had also arrived in their dragon forms, presumably to transport Krivax and Vizier Hadix, who were both far too large to mount a griffin. Already waiting there was Illidan, notably free of his sentinel watchers, as he glared toward the site of Shenzhen Su. All of the elf's wardens had been far too injured during the fight with Gul'dan to continue with their duties, leaving Illidan relatively free of supervision. Krivax had no doubt that the Kaldoi would complain once they learned he hadn't contacted them immediately after Illidan's wardens were incapacitated, but that was a matter for later. There were far more important things to deal with at the moment than elvish sensibilities. In addition, Fordring had arrived while still wielding the Silver Hand, so empowered by the light that the ambient necromantic magic left behind by the scourge was purified by his mere presence. The nearby Alliance soldiers occasionally glanced at the paladin with open reverence, likely as a result of his various feats in the defense of Dalaran. Apparently, Fordring had been nearly single-handedly responsible for preventing the scourge from approaching the portal hub, turning back a large wave of undead with the power of the light. Krivax predicted that there would be many legends made from this conflict, and Tyrion Fordring was undoubtedly one of them. A variety of other figures were preparing themselves for battle, including Team Ronin and many members of the Alliance's aerial combat forces likely sent to escort them. Their assistance would be crucial to safely make it through the Scourge's defenses. As the leader of the Alliance Defense Force, Krivax knew that he was the only one who had the authority to organize these disparate elements into a fighting force, so he didn't hesitate to take on that role. "If everyone is prepared, then we are leaving as quickly as possible," Krivax said as he approached the group, knowing that time was of the essence. "This is Shangzai. While he is an undead, he has sworn that he means no harm and has pledged to help us destroy the Lich King. I trust his intentions. Does anyone have any complaints?" There was a moment where everyone traded looks, their expressions ranging from indifferent to distinctly uncomfortable. Illidan and the Nerubians were closer to the former end of the spectrum, while pretty much everyone else seemed much more concerned. Archmage Crossus was one of them, likely because Shangzai's necromantic magic felt like a blight to his sensibilities as a red dragon, but he said nothing after Krivax gave him a nod showing his approval of the undead. The most important opinion by far belonged to Tyrion Fordring, who everyone else looked to as the paladin locked gazes with Shangzai. After several moments of tense silence, Fordring finally spoke, his voice calm yet carrying an underlying strength that resonated with conviction. "If Krivax trusts the undead, and he is here to fight against the Lich King, then I see no reason to object. We all have a common enemy, and every hand raised against the scourge is needed in this battle. His words seemed to alleviate the tension amongst the group, and the others nodded in agreement, albeit with some still having obvious reservations. The presence of an undead, especially so soon after the scourge's attack on Dalaran, was not something easily accepted. However, the dire circumstances and Fordring's approval was enough to convince them. Appreciating Fordring's support, Krivax gave the paladin a nod of thanks before turning his attention back to the group. As you have hopefully been informed, our mission is to do as much damage to Shenzhen Su as possible with the goal of hampering its efforts to escape into Laudermere Lake, Krivax explained, his voice carrying over the group. If we fail, then it is doubtful that very many of the Alliance's forces on its shell will be able to escape before they either drown or are torn to pieces by the many undead in the lake. Krivax's blunt assessment of the situation was enough for a sense of solemn foreboding to fall over the group as everyone glanced toward the scene in Laudermere Lake. Shenzhen Su was still raised well over the surface of Laudermere Lake on top of an artificially raised landmass with its edges shaped into massive, inward-facing spikes of earth. It likely required the entirety of Keeper Arkida's attention to keep the enormous creature trapped through its constant struggles. Leveraging its strength and sheer weight, Shenzhen Su was destroying portions of the platform with each snap of its jaw or swing of its limbs, causing tremors that could be felt all the way in Dalaran. The very sight was enough to inspire both dread and awe in everyone watching. The best method of hampering Shenzhen Su's struggles would be to destroy one of its forward limbs, though we must obviously ensure that we aren't simply crushed under one of its wild blows, Krivax said grimly, drawing the attention of the group back to him. He'd considered a few other targets before setting on the front limbs. Shenzhen Su's back limbs were not being used to attack nearly as much, and its head was one of its most heavily defended locations, both due to its vital nature and its proximity to the Lich King. Therefore, I believe our best option is to land on its shell and use magic to burrow through its undead flesh until we reach the joint of its limbs, Krivax continued, sharing the rest of his plan as he watched the group for their reaction. That should be the best location for us to attack. Krivax was relieved to see that nobody had any serious objections to his plan. It was a relatively straightforward strategy, but likely their best bet given how little time they had to prepare. Would it not be better to attack both limbs at the same time? Asked one of the Alliance soldiers. The Scourge will defend with everything they have. It will be difficult enough to destroy a single limb, let alone two, Fordring responded immediately. I'll also be relying on Paladin Fordring to shield us from the Lich King's blizzard, said Krivax, addressing the soldier. Without him using the light to protect us, we would likely be either swarmed by spirits or frozen solid long before we can accomplish our mission. That seemed to be enough to convince everyone of Krivax's plans, and they quickly focused on the details of the mission. Specifically, Shangzai suggested that they attack Shenzhen Su's right limb, as there was a cave system on that side which should bring them marginally closer to the creature's joint and serve as a defensive location. With that, everyone moved to get on top of their griffin while Krivax awkwardly climbed atop Archmage Crossus and secured himself with some webs. He could tell that he wasn't the only one who was uncomfortable, as Vizier Hadix wore a distinctly disgruntled expression as he skittered onto Kaselgo's scaled back. Krivax would probably laugh at the ridiculous sight of a Nerubian vizier riding a dragon if he wasn't in the exact same situation. If I survive this, I definitely need to find a better way to fly, Krivax thought as their group took flight and began making their way to Shenzhen Su. Given that he was the most experienced candidate for the role, Archmage Crossus took command over the aerial combat. It didn't take long before the Scourge noticed their approach and redirected a portion of its forces to intercept them, though the majority were still focused on attacking Naxxcathal and the main Alliance assault. Krivax engulfed both himself and Archmage Crossus in life-infused flames to protect them from smaller undead such as insects or giant birds that attempted to swarm them. Archmage Crossus handled many of the larger undead with furious swipes of his claws or powerful spells that destroyed any Scourge who approached them. To the left side of their formation, Vizier Hadix created large webs of arcane magic in the air that hindered the movements of the undead, while Kulkagos immediately blew them apart with missiles of arcane magic. Proving his adaptability and experience as a warrior, Illidan learned how to guide his griffin with surprising finesse and fearlessly flew close enough to the undead that he could strike with his twin blades. Each attack unleashed a burst of bright fellfire that jumped between undead, killing them just as easily as it would have killed the living. Paladin Fordring, ever the beacon of hope amidst the chaos, hardly needed to swing his weapon at all, as few undead were able to approach close to him through the intense aura of light that radiated from him and the Silver Hand. Those few that did were left weakened and destroyed with almost contemptuous ease, perfectly exemplifying just how well suited paladins were for fighting the undead. Despite their team's power, the Scourge vastly outnumbered them and only became more numerous the closer they drew to Shen Zin Su. At one point, an eerie peaked dwarf and his griffin was seized by a tendril of water that rose from Laudermere Lake and pulled them screaming beneath its depths, the entire process happening too quickly for anyone to react. Any undead beneath the lake with a method of attacking them at range attempted to do so, forcing them to fly higher than they would have otherwise liked. Before long, they breached the outer perimeter of the blizzard surrounding Shen Zin Su, where the Scourge only intensified their attacks. The air crackled with necromantic energy, and the visibility dropped drastically as an oppressive blanket of cold that sapped all strength and hope fell over them. Beyond the hollowing of the winds, Krivax could even hear the screams of spirits being controlled by the Lich King as their ethereal forms flew toward them through the blizzard. Krivax had experienced many truly terrifying things during his second life, but there was something about those haunting wails that pulled at his soul. "Fall in around the paladin," Archmage Crossus yelled over the cacophony, his voice amplified by magic to make himself heard. The group quickly reorganized at the Archmage's command and drew closer to Fordring, whose aura of light created a sanctuary amidst the blizzard. However, this didn't protect them completely, as the lack of visibility meant that the Scourge could more easily ambush them. When an unfortunate mage to the rear was torn from their griffin by an undead cloud serpent that emerged from the mists and quickly disappeared with its prize, their group adjusted to focus primarily on defense. As they approached Shen Zin Su, the true size and scale of the undead turtle became ever more daunting as Krivax got his first look of the creature up close. Its colossal form loomed like a mountain above the lake, making Keeper Arkida's feat of entrapping it even more impressive. However, Krivax could tell that the earth spikes around it were being reformed slower each time they were destroyed than when he had last looked at them. It was a clear sign that even Keeper Arkida's had his limits and would eventually reach them. "Shangzai, where is the cave system that you mentioned?" Krivax yelled, urgency guiding him as their group flew over a destroyed village filled with undead on the left side of Shen Zin Su's shell. The undead monk only took a moment to scan his gaze over his former home before pointing toward a small entrance in a series of cliffs north of the destroyed village. "There. The Shrine of Inner Light is located inside that cave system." With their final destination located, Archmage Crossus guided them toward the cliffs as the Scourge began chasing after them with ever-increasing numbers. Every inch of Shen Zin Su's shell was crawling with undead creatures as far as Krivax could see, a clear sign of how clearly seriously the Scourge was taking them as a threat. It was only seconds after their group landed at the entrance to the Shrine of Inner Light that they were swarmed by every undead in the area. Even with the ridiculous power of their group, it was only due to the defensive choke point offered by the cave's entrance that they weren't swiftly overwhelmed. "Illidan, Vizier Hadix. You two move on ahead to destroy the joint," Krivax called out as he used geomancy to open a sinkhole beneath an undead sea giant. This caused it to fall to the ground, where Fordring immediately finished it off with a swing of his hammer. They had discussed this beforehand and decided that those two would be the best ones for the task. Vizier Hadix knew enough geomancy to dig them through any collapses in the cave system, while Illidan could use fellfire to burn a tunnel through undead flesh until they reached the joint. According to Shangzai, the Dreadlords had also used fellfire to dig into Shen Zin Su's inner organs as a method of killing it, so the tactic would no doubt be effective. From there, Vizier Haedix only needed to use the mana bombs provided by the blue dragonflight and placed in the vizier's spatial bag to finish the job. With the joint destroyed, Shen Xinsu's struggles would be drastically weakened, and the Alliance's main army would have enough time to perform that ritual that would put the poor creature out of its misery. Illidan and Haedix charged into the cave system without further word, neither of them the type to waste time when action was needed. By the light's grace, we shall give them the time they need. To arms! Tyrion Fordring called out as he raised the silver hand high above his head and unleashed a wave of light that washed over them. Krivax felt the light completely wash away the weariness he'd been accumulating since the fight in Dalaran. Judging by the expressions of his allies, he wasn't the only one who was rejuvenated just in time to face the bulk of the Scourge's forces converging on their location. Sharing a quick glance with Archmage Crossus, he and Krivax combined their efforts to summon a massive wall of life-infused flames that smothered the Scourge's charge as undead were burned to ash upon contact. Meanwhile, Tyrion Fordring let out a bellow and charged forward, actually causing several undead to recoil from his mere presence. The next few minutes were a blur of combat as they fought for their lives. This close to the Lich King, the air was nearly completely saturated with necromantic magic, and undead were more formidable than Krivax had ever experienced. Ghouls that would normally be destroyed by a single hit took many hits to go down, and the larger undead creatures moved with speed and agility that belied their size. Bringing Shang Zai proved to be a wise decision, as the Death Monk was both similarly empowered and an extremely capable combatant. He moved with grace and deadly efficiency as each of his strikes shattered the skulls of another undead. At one point, he even somehow split into multiple forms, a skill Krivax vaguely remembered as being something monks were capable of doing, allowing Shang Zai to engage several enemies simultaneously. Despite everything, the Scourge was still a near-overwhelming force that their group could only barely hold back. Damn it! Krivax cursed as he pulled an undead skitterer off his chest and threw it to the ground, stomping on it a moment later in an effort to conserve his magic. Crossus, there are too many. We need to fall back into the cave. A ghoul attempted to exploit his distraction by leaping toward his face with outstretched claws, but was almost immediately impaled by Masruk's spear and promptly disposed of. Archmage Crossus finished his spell before responding, causing a swirling inferno to materialize in the Scourge ranks that engulfed several dozen undead before being countered by an icy gust that extinguished the flames. "This is the best defensive point that we could hope for," Crossus yelled as he just barely dodged the claws of a spirit that emerged from the walls of the cave. His magic flashed again, disintegrating the undead in a burst of flames. "We must not retreat until the last possible moment." Krivax let out another curse as he reached into his spatial bag before throwing an alchemical flask at a charging sea giant, causing a potent explosion of arcane magic that transformed the undead into a crystalline statue. Their group had recognized that it would be unlikely for them to escape back the way they came, which was why all of their mounts had been ushered into the cave first. With geomancy, they could create an exit whenever necessary, but the Shrine of Inner Light had many interconnected tunnels that the Scourge could use to flank them if they were pushed farther into the cave system. Crossus was right that they needed to hold on as long as possible. Unfortunately, Krivax soon realized that this would become even more difficult as he sensed a familiar demon rapidly approaching their location. "Fordring! Above you!" Krivax shouted. Thankfully, the paladin didn't hesitate to heed his warning and immediately leapt back toward the group just in time to avoid the dreadlord who crashed down where he had been standing like a meteor. Fordring was barely able to get the silver hand up in time to prevent the dreadlord's claws from tearing out his guts as the demon furiously surged out of the crater it had created. Krivax immediately recognized that this was the same dreadlord who had been leading the Scourge's attack on the capital city. It was no surprise that the demon had returned to Shen Xinsu to defend the Lich King given the circumstances. According to Alliance intelligence, the Dreadlord hadn't been shy about announcing his name while helping slaughter capital city's sparse garrison, and has been identified as Balnazar. Krivax instantly cast a geomancy spell that caused the ground beneath the Dreadlord to heave violently and knock the demon off balance while Fordring swung at him with a silver hand. However, Balnazar managed to teleport away moments before being struck and reappeared in the Scourge lines. Not long after, it became clear that the Dreadlord had begun commanding the undead forces as several Naga sea witches lined up and summoned a flood of icy waters meant to sweep them away. This forced their group to fall back into the cave as Krivax frantically summoned an arcane barrier, with the help of Archmage Crossus, Ronin, and Kulkos, to prevent the flood from entering the cave. Unfortunately, the Scourge had many Naga within their ranks and the other side of the barrier was being constantly assaulted by heavy weapons as the undead swam through the summoned flood of water. "I think now is a good time to fall back," Krivax called out, his voice tense as he strained to hold the barrier. "Archmage Crossus, I'm going to release my barrier and use geomancy to collapse the cave's entrance. I need you to hold them back while I cast the spell." Crossus nodded, his expression steadfast as he redoubled his efforts. Not wasting the opportunity, Krivax released his barrier while beginning to cast the necessary spell. Moments later, the earth began to shake as the stone at the cave's entrance exploded inwards, burying several undead under a massive pile of debris and effectively sealing the entrance. At least, temporarily sealing the entrance. Nearly immediately afterward, Krivax spotted the eerie green of fellfire from the other side of the debris, indicating that the Dreadlord intended to melt through the pile of undead flesh and rock. Krivax and the rest of the group quickly made their way deeper into the Shrine of Inner Light, occasionally leaving behind magical traps. It was clear from their surroundings that the shrine had likely once been a beautiful and sacred place where the local Pandaren had gone to venerate their ancestors. The shattered statues of notable Pandaren littered the ground, the signs of the Scourge's desecration evident in every corner. The air was heavy with the stench of decay and necromantic magic, a stark contrast to the beauty that must have once pervaded these halls. Every time their group found a good defensive location, they set up traps and defenses to delay the Scourge as long as possible. Balnazar repeated his attempt to drown them out with the Naga spellcasters, but Krivax predicted that and was quick to respond by freezing each incoming wave solid, creating a protective barrier between them and the Scourge. Despite relying more on fire after receiving Alexstrasza's empowerment, Krivax had always been more skilled with ice magic and forced the Dreadlord to abandon his tactic. However, the Scourge's overwhelming numbers meant that they faced a constant onslaught of undead and were eventually pushed back to the main chamber of the shrine. At the end of the chamber, Krivax spotted a tunnel that had most likely been created by Illidan and Vizier Hadix if the faint traces of fellfire were any indication. This meant they had nowhere left to retreat, lest they allow the Scourge to prevent Illidan and Hadix from completing their mission. With that knowledge, their group quickly created as many defensive fortifications as possible while Team Ronin ushered the flying mounts down the tunnel in preparation for their eventual escape. The Scourge was never going to allow them the time to create another exit, so they would simply have to fly out of Shen Zinsu's detached limb once its joint was destroyed. It was a risky plan, but also their best option given the circumstances. It didn't take long for the Balnazar to catch up to them, his expression furious as he commanded a full-scale assault on their position. The narrow confines of the Shrine of Inner Light turned the battle into a brutal close-quarters fight, where every inch of ground was fiercely contested. Since their group had no intention of returning from the route they came, Krivax made liberal use of geomancy to crush as many undead as possible, reshaping the cave's environment to his advantage. Tyrion Fordring proved an impassable bulwark as he used the light to prevent any undead from passing him and bolster the spirit of his allies. Meanwhile, Shangzai fought with surprising ferocity as he leapt toward the Dreadlord, his strikes clearly indicating his fury even as his expression remained tranquil. The battle was grueling, with every second feeling like an eternity. Krivax could personally feel the strain of the relentless assault as he destroyed corpse after shambling corpse of the innocent slain by the Scourge. Even if he had magically enhanced endurance, Krivax still began to grow both mentally and magically exhausted by the endless undead. He wasn't the only one being affected by this exhaustion, which Balnazar eventually took advantage of as he found an opening in their defenses. Teleporting away from one of Shangzai's strikes, the Dreadlord reappeared at Fordring's side and struck with a speed that belied his size. Fordring, ever vigilant, managed to prevent Balnazar from striking a lethal blow but still suffered a grievous injury to his side. The paladin staggered, pain etched on his face as blood seeped through his armor, his aura of light fading as it fought against the felfire in his wound. That brief moment, where the light faltered and they lost the bolstered morale that came with it, caused a ripple of shock to pass through their group. Krivax could only look on in horror as Balnazar seemed set to take advantage of this momentary lapse to strike down Fordring for good. In this critical moment, a roar of fury and fire echoed through the tunnel behind Krivax as a blur of movement suddenly burst past him, his twin blades a whirlwind of destruction. In an impressive show of speed, Balnazar was just barely able to turn in time to meet Illidan's attack. Sensing a predictable surge of magic that indicated the Dreadlord was about to teleport away, Krivax immediately cast a quick counterspell. This would not stop the demon for more than a second, but that was just enough time for Shangzai to land a strike on Balnazar's side that caused the demon's flesh to rot with necromantic magic. As the Dreadlord faltered, Illidan didn't hesitate to take advantage with a lightning-fast strike that resulted in the demon's head falling to the ground a moment later. "Tell the Burning Legion that I'm coming for them, demon vermin," Illidan snarled with obvious hatred, and the Dreadlord's corpse collapsed. "I don't think he heard you," Krivax thought to himself as he summoned a wall of fire between their group and the rampaging undead. "We can't stay here. With Fordring injured, I don't think we'll be able to last much longer," Krivax said, addressing the group before turning to Illidan. "Has Hadix planted the mana bombs? Were you able to destroy the joint?" Before Illidan could respond, Krivax received his answer in the form of a deafening explosion that shook the entire cavern. Dust and debris rained down around them as Archmage crosses created an arcane barrier above their heads. "That's our sign to leave," Krivax announced urgency as he rushed to Fordring's side and helped cleanse the paladin's wound. The group made a fighting retreat as they descended the tunnel of Shen Xinsu's decayed flesh. Fortunately, there was little the Scourge could do to stop them due to the enclosed terrain, allowing Illidan to protect their rear with almost contemptuous ease. Eventually, they reached the end of the tunnel where Vizier Hadix was waiting for them with an impatient expression and began the awkward process of helping everyone mount their flying creatures. When they finally managed to do so and everyone flew out of the hole that was Shen Xinsu's detached limb, Krivax got his first look at the results of their efforts. As an undead creature, the enormous turtle hadn't seemed to react much to losing a limb, but the awkwardness of its movements made clear that they had significantly impaired its mobility. Sea turtles already weren't the most dexterous of creatures on land, and with Shen Xinsu's massive size, the loss of a limb made his efforts to maneuver even more cumbersome. The once mighty beast struggled to maintain any balance as it uselessly attacked its earthen prison, now relying mostly on his jaws to gnaw at the spikes entrapping it. Krivax allowed himself a moment to enjoy the feeling of victory before calling out to the rest of the group. "Let's meet up with the Alliance's main assault at the Temple of Five Dawns." This should have bought enough time for them to complete the ritual. Everyone immediately agreed with his decision and seemed in high spirits as they began flying toward the Temple of Five Dawns. Krivax was also rather encouraged by the success of their mission, but he couldn't help but feel faintly unsettled by what he was sensing at the Alliance's main battlefront near the temple. He could tell that the Alliance had managed to secure the Temple of Five Dawns as the structure was clear of undead and filled with living creatures, but he couldn't sense the typical surge of magic that he would associate with an ongoing ritual. Krivax had the sharpest sensory abilities of anyone in the group, so he was almost certainly the only one who had noticed this discrepancy. Still, as Krivax looked at the champions who had managed to successfully fight their way through the heart of Scourge territory and survive, he found that he wasn't too worried. Regardless of what complication they were about to face, the Alliance had many heroes ready to face Gul'dan and put an end to the Lich King permanently. So long as that remained the case, the Scourge's days were numbered. Krivax and the rest of his group faced fewer and fewer undead the closer they approached the Temple of Five Dawns. He could see that the Alliance had successfully secured the structure, though the Scourge continued to assault their location from all sides. They were being held off by light wielders from all across the Alliance standing at the vanguard. Guardians of Nerub, the Order of the Silver Hammer, and Drenii Paladins all fought off constant waves of undead. Prophet Velen made a particularly impressive spectacle, pulsing with novas of radiant light that incinerated dozens of undead with each blast. Keeper Archidas towered over the battlefield in his true form, arms raised high and eyes staring off into the distance as arcane magic swirled around him. Despite his inorganic and stoic expression, Krivax could sense something within his magic that felt strained and threatening to falter. It seemed that even a demigod magical robot created by actual gods was having difficulty containing a creature as large as Shenzin Su. Turning his attention back to the Temple of Five Dawns, Krivax felt his unease grow. He'd hoped that he would be able to sense the Alliance's ritual once he drew closer, but that wasn't the case. Krivax was almost certain by now that something had gone terribly wrong with the ritual to slay Shenzin Su, and he urgently needed to figure out exactly what that was. Most of the group split off from Krivax and Crossus to help the Alliance fend off the Scourge. The situation was too dire and their potential contributions too significant for them to spend time doing anything but fighting. That was one of the reasons why Krivax was so concerned to sense 5 members of the Council of 6 sitting in the Temple of Five Dawns. The moment Crossus landed, Krivax was already jumping off the dragon and making his way inside of the structure. The interior was littered with the signs of intense battle, the corpses of demons, undead, and members of the Alliance all mixed together in a grim tableau. Krivax could sense the lingering effects of intense fel and arcane magic in the air, leaving no room for doubt that the dreadlord stationed here hadn't gone down quietly. Nobody attempted to stop Krivax or Crossus as they made their way through the temple, instead pointing them toward the room where the Council of 6 was supposed to be conducting the ritual. When Krivax finally arrived at his destination, it was immediately obvious what had gone wrong. The Council of 6 had chosen to confront the Dreadlord in what appeared to be a control center where the demon commanded the Scourge, scrying mirrors all around the room showing different parts of the battlefield. Pieces of the demon himself, a single bat-like wing, and one of his large horns were laying on the far side of the room. The rest of the Dreadlord was nowhere to be seen, implying that he had managed to escape before the Council of 6 could inflict the final blow. Successfully escaping from 6 archmages was an extremely impressive feat, especially given the identity of the other corpse laying on the ground. Krivax had a feeling that Archmage Kel'Thuzad wasn't exactly in a state to conduct a ritual given that the majority of his internal organs were currently strewn across the room. The Council of 6 was engaged in an increasingly loud argument with Alliance High Command through one of the scrying mirrors, attempting to decide on a path forward now that their initial plan was ruined. "How did this happen?" Krivax immediately said, pulling aside Archmage Modera for an explanation as the rest of the council continued their heated discussion. Crossus joined their side, his expression grim as he studied the corpse of his longtime colleague. Tichondrius was far more dangerous than we anticipated, Archmage Modera admitted, her tone filled with regret. "We were cautious when we entered the temple, but we didn't expect it would be difficult to defeat the Dreadlord with all of our effort combined. The demon must have thought so as well, because he didn't confront us directly at all and launched an ambush that caught us off guard." Krivax listened carefully as the Archmage explained what happened in great detail. Apparently, the Council of 6 had begun their assault on the Temple of Five Dawn by sending in a wave of water elementals, golems, and other expendable forces which couldn't be turned into undead. They had rightfully anticipated the temple to be a heavily fortified location with large numbers of traps and wanted these constructs to move in before the Alliance's soldiers. That proved to be a good decision as the first wave of constructs was indeed met with magical traps filling every hallway, hundreds of undead, and many angry demons. The constructs put up a decent fight, but were very quickly overwhelmed by the Scourge's entrenched forces. After developing a decent understanding of the temple's defenses, the Council of Six decided to contribute more directly to the assault. Several dozen Kirin Tor mages were left behind to maintain barriers and anti-spatial wards that would prevent any means of escape for the Dreadlord while the archmages entered the temple. The battle was difficult, but there were only a handful of individuals more skilled in magic than the Council of Six. Grand Magus Antonidas in particular was a once-in-a-generation prodigy, so they had managed to make significant headway through the temple's defenses. Sadly, once they finally reached the room from where the Dreadlord had been commanding the Scourge forces, they failed to discover the demon and instead found his lieutenants and a small army of undead waiting for them. The Council of Six managed to defeat the Scourge forces and capture a few of the more intelligent undead so that they could extract information from them. While torture was ineffective on demons or undead, tearing knowledge directly from their minds worked just as well with them as it did on mortals. This led to them discovering that the Dreadlord, Tichondrius, had supposedly not returned to the temple after leaving Dalaran and instead went to command the Scourge from the Lich King's fortress. The Council of Six understood how cunning Dreadlords could be and considered the possibility that this was some manner of trap, but it seemed exceedingly unlikely at the time. The Temple of Five Dawns had been completely occupied by the Alliance, surrounded by the Kirin Tor's magical defenses, and the Scourge had genuinely lost many valuable undead in its defense. The Alliance would have normally done a more thorough evaluation before declaring the temple as having been secured, but there was a limited amount of time to perform the ritual before Shenzin Su managed to escape. Therefore, they decided to take what seemed like a justifiable risk that very quickly turned into a catastrophic miscalculation. The Council of Six began the ritual to kill Shenzin Su as soon as possible, trusting the Kirin Tor to guard them against any attempted disruption. Nobody anticipated that Tichondrius had managed to quietly kill one of those very same Kirin Tor guards during the assault and successfully replaced them. Looking back, that light-forsaken demon likely saw that the ritual was being led by Kel'Thuzad and decided to target him specifically, Archmage Modera said, her hands white as she tightly gripped her staff. One moment we were making steady progress, and the next, Kel'Thuzad had a Dreadlord's claws impaled through his stomach and the room was engulfed in fellfire. If not for the Grand Magus, Tichondrius' ambush would have killed more than just one of us. Krivax could only imagine the consequences if that had come to pass. The Alliance was already facing an uphill battle and needed every powerhouse it could get its hand on if it wanted to defeat the Lich King. How did the Dreadlord manage to escape after launching his ambush? Crossus asked, placing a comforting hand on Modera's shoulder that she barely seemed to notice, lost in her own thoughts. I thought the temple had been secured with wards. Modera sighed deeply and took a moment to collect herself before responding. The demons must have been planning this since Naxxkethel appeared over Shenzin Su. The other Dreadlord leading their aerial defenses launched a simultaneous attack on the mages who were maintaining the wards. Enough of them were killed that Tichondrius succeeded in teleporting away before we could finish the filthy creature for good. As Archmage Modera finished explaining what had happened, Krivax immediately understood just how much Kel'Thuzad's death ruined the Alliance's plans. The ritual to kill Shenzin Su was one that Kel'Thuzad had created himself while conducting his personal research into necromantic magic. The Alliance had plenty of genius mages at its disposal who could learn how the ritual worked and reproduce it, but doing so would take time that they didn't have. From what Krivax could understand by listening to the ongoing argument happening between the Council of Six and Alliance High Command, Keeper Archidas could likely only keep Shenzin Su contained for a few more hours. It was fortunate that the Alliance Defense Force had been successful with its operation to cripple the massive turtle, or that estimate would be even shorter. Unfortunately, the Alliance didn't exactly have any contingencies in place to deal with this situation. The Scourge's attack on Dalaran was too sudden for them to have made the necessary preparations and not enough time for most plans to work. Having received a full update on the situation, Krivax made his way over to the Council of Six so he could better hear the ongoing discussion. Retreat is not an option that we should be considering, said High King Anubarak, his tone decisive and unyielding. We will have few opportunities in the future to end the Lich King's threat to our people that are as advantageous as this one. While it's doubtful Shenzin Su could escape Laudermere Lake and return to the ocean, we do not know if the Dreadlords have the means to evacuate the Lich King. If they do, then they will doubtlessly hide in some already prepared location beyond our reach. The High King's position was unsurprising to Krivax. Azrael Nerub was more willing than most mortal nations to suffer significant casualties in the pursuit of its objectives. Even if every single Nerubian currently on Shenzin Su ended up drowning in Laudermere Lake, Azrael Nerub could replenish those numbers within a few years so long as it had enough food. Krivax also agreed that this was likely their best possible chance to decisively deal with the Lich King without a multi-years-long campaign that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Had Gul'dan chosen to keep Shenzin Su at the bottom of the ocean and direct the scourge from there, it was doubtful that the Alliance would have had many options. He had spoken to Malagos about that exact scenario, and knew even the aspects considered it a risk to face such a powerful enemy in such an disadvantageous environment. The current situation, as difficult as it was, provided a unique opportunity that had only come about as a result of Gul'dan's arrogance. The one to respond to the High King was a stern, female high elf wearing armor on the other side of a scrying mirror. Krivax had never met her, but he assumed that he was currently looking at Sylvanas Windrunner, Ranger General of Quel'Thalas. "Not all of us are so willing to accept losing so many of our people," said Sylvanas, equally resolute as she spoke against the High King. "Unless someone can propose a reasonable method of slaying Shenzin Su or otherwise preventing the imminent destruction of our forces, then Quel'Thalas will order the evacuation of our soldiers. It's possible that we could destroy the creature's head if we use all of our explosives and redirect our aerial forces to an offensive operation," Supreme Command Lothar said hesitantly, obviously reluctant to take that course of action. However, the undead seem to become increasingly powerful the closer in proximity they are to the Lich King. Our air force would take significant casualties if they were forced to engage the scourge so close to the enemy's center of power and away from Naxxcathul. According to Shang Zai, the Lich King was located in what the locals referred to as the Wood of Staves. It was a grove that served as the final resting place for Pandaren elders, who were buried there alongside their staves. It didn't take a genius to guess why the Lich King had chosen this location. The Dreadlords had moved the giant ice cube in which the Lich King was imprisoned there before directing the Scourge to build a massive fortress around Gul'dan for his protection. Worse yet, this fortress was supposedly constructed with a type of metal alloy nearly as strong as Titan steel, which the Scourge had sourced from the Isle of Thunder. All in all, the final siege on the Lich King wasn't going to be easy once the time for it actually came. Most importantly, the Wood of Staves was very close to Shenzin Su's head. "There's no guarantee that we have enough explosives to accomplish such a mission regardless," Sylvanas immediately responded. "Nor that doing so would be enough to slay Shenzin Su. Does an undead that powerful even need its head to function?" I once asked Kel'Thuzes this very same question, and he explained that it depends on the nature of the undead and how it was raised, said Grand Magus Antonidas, offering his expertise as the most knowledgeable on this particular subject. Many non-corporeal undead such as ghosts, specters, and banshees are fully capable of functioning and maintaining the intelligence with no physical brain to rely on. Undead with physical bodies cannot typically do so, especially those that are sapient. It's unlikely that Shenzin Su is an exception. The rules regarding undead survivability were highly inconsistent in Warcraft lore from what Krivax could recall. There were examples such as some undead surviving complete dismemberment and other examples of undead being killed by a mere broken neck. Destroying the brain was the most surefire method of killing a corporeal undead. Grand Magus Antonidas spent the next minute explaining why that was, though obviously dumbing down the magical theory significantly. Something about how souls molded themselves to resemble their most recent physical body and mimic the functions of that form, resulting in necromantic spell components relating to bodily control tending to congregate in the brain. Or something like that anyways. Unlike Antonidas, Krivax wasn't a genius who could easily understand the intricacies of an entirely different school of magic. That's all well and good, but the complications that we've previously discussed mean that we are still bereft of options, Sylvana said sharply, clearly beginning to lose her patience. Any plan we decide on, whether it be retreat or otherwise, will take time to implement. Time which is running short. The discussion once again devolved into a chaotic mix of suggestions and heated debates as everyone attempted to figure out the best path forward. In summary, Shen Xinsu needed to be killed so that the Alliance could safely launch an assault on the Lich King, and the only paths to do so were either to destroy the creature's soul or brain. Since the Alliance had no means to destroy the former without Kel'Thuzad, all the suggested plans revolved around the latter. Things became a bit worse when the Alliance's specialists from Nerubian calculated that Shen Xinsu's skull could likely withstand more force than their munitions could bring to bear. Even if Naxxt'l was to fire all of its cannons directly into the creature's face, it would likely be as effective as throwing rocks at a mountain. This was why most of the suggestions involved magic, but the likelihood that the Alliance would be able to fight through so many undead to reach their target was not all that good. Krivax's mind raced as everyone attempted to come up with a solution to the problem. He knew that he could never out-strategize the Alliance's top generals when it came to conventional warfare, but this wasn't a normal situation that could be solved with standard tactics. Therefore, Krivax did his best to think outside of the box. After several minutes of considering every option that came to mind, the only plan that Krivax had managed to pull together was a bit more outside of the box than he would have liked. Krivax was worried it would be rejected out of hand, so he decided to first ask a few more questions to ensure his plan was actually feasible. Would our forces here be able to hold against the Scourge without the Council of Six if Naxxtl was repositioned? Krivax asked, interrupting the ongoing debate. His question caused a brief pause as everyone considered the implications of moving such a significant asset from the front lines. It would be difficult, but Azrael Nerub can deploy enough reinforcements to hold back the Scourge. High King Nerubian spoke first, likely trusting Krivax's competency more than the non-Nerubians. You wish to use the safety of Naxxtl to protect the Alliance's mages while they perform a ritual? This is the only explanation which would justify moving the Council of Six from their current positions. Krivax was unsurprised that the High King had seen through his intentions so quickly, though he doubted Nerubian would be pleased with his plan once he actually heard the full thing. Even with the safety of Naxxtl, I cannot imagine any ritual that is both simple enough to be completed within a few hours and also powerful enough to achieve our goal, said Grand Magus Antonidas, glancing at Krivax with clear skepticism. Any plan we settle on needs to not only reliably overwhelm Shen Xinsu's natural defenses, but also any attempted interruption from the Scourge. It is a monumental task. Krivax could tell from the expressions of everyone that they also doubted that he could have come up with a plan that none of them had already considered. Well, what I have in mind is definitely both simple and effective, said Krivax, hesitating for a moment before mustering his courage and continuing. I propose that we reinforce Naxxtl's lower portions by combining our magical efforts in a straightforward abjuration ritual before moving it directly above Shen Xinsu's head. Then, after some extremely precise calculations, we simply deactivate the Necropolis flight enchantments and let gravity do the rest. The stunned silence that followed after Krivax finished speaking was palpable. Unsurprisingly, High King Nerubian was the first to respond after a long pause, and he definitely wasn't happy. You wish to use the fortress our kingdom spent several years of meticulous research and a fortune larger than the combined wealth of several nations to build as a mere projectile? Said High King Nerubian, his voice more incredulous and dumbstruck than Krivax had ever heard from the Spider-Lord. It has not even seen service for a single day, yet you would see it sacrificed in such a manner? Oh, only after it's been reinforced by an abjuration shield, Your Majesty, Krivax was quick to say, attempting to reassure the High King. The Circle of Viziers has done meticulous calculations for Naxxtl's dimensions, weight, and structural integrity to ensure it is flight capable. It shouldn't take them but a few moments to determine a safe height to drop it from, ensuring maximum impact without risking the integrity of the necropolis itself. Krivax genuinely believed that ending the Lich King now was worth whatever price that Azrael-Nerub needed to pay. It sounds ridiculous, but there's no doubt that such a maneuver would slay Shen Xinsu, Sylvana said hesitantly, though she didn't sound as opposed to the plan as he had expected. The weight of Naxxkethel should easily be within the hundreds of thousands of tons, perhaps even in the millions given the vast number of personnel and equipment on board. It would also open a new front of the battlefield much closer than our current position, and I doubt even those cunning dreadlords would anticipate such an unconventional tactic. Creating an arcane barrier is one of the first things that Dalaran teaches our students, and is simple enough that even those with minimal training can contribute, said Grand Magus Antonidas, his voice thoughtful as he considered the plan's feasibility. The ritual would need to be modified to support so many mages, but it's well within my abilities to do so. Despite the High King's obvious reluctance, the conversation quickly turned to all of the various logistical difficulties involved with dropping a flying fortress atop the head of the giant undead turtle, several of which Krivax had not considered. The circle of viziers would need to brace every room within the structure for impact with magic. The Alliance forces would need to be carefully redistributed to ensure the front line didn't fall apart, and there would need to be a strategy for how they would proceed in the aftermath. As Krivax listened to all of these discussions take place, he was stunned to find that nobody could find any reasons for why his plan wouldn't work. The Alliance's strategists and the Circle of Viziers all went over the calculations involved in dropping Naxxkethel several times and reached the conclusion that the lowest levels should indeed be able to survive the impact. The structural damage would definitely be severe enough to compromise the necropolis flight enchantments, but everyone aboard should be safe with proper warding and that damage could be fixed. Eventually. There was even a brief moment where someone suggested they simply drop Naxxkethel on the Lich King and squash him like a bug. While that would be a very amusing way to end the war, the Lich King's Titan steel fortress was determined to be significantly more durable than Shen Xinsu's skull, much to Krivax's disappointment. Someone like Gul'dan deserved to die from having a 1,000,000-ton flying fortress suddenly dropped on his head rather than in a climactic fight. Unfortunately, it didn't seem like that option was on the table. After spending a significant amount of time testing and resolving all the issues with Krivax's plan, everyone began to grow excited as they finally found a path forward. The only one who wasn't entirely on board was High King Nerubian, who had remained uncharacteristically silent for most of the discussion and only spoke to share the Circle of Viziers' assessments. Krivax was confident that this was the best plan given their current circumstances, so the High King needed to be convinced to approve it despite the fact that it would cost Azrael-Nerub far more than anyone else. Not only was the truly immense cost of Naxxkethel an issue, but there was a great risk that the surface races would attempt to reverse engineer the magical technology that went into its creation. The kingdom was already one of the most significant contributors in terms of manpower, so losing Naxxkethel as well was no small matter. Your Majesty, I understand Naxxkethel isn't an asset that Azrael-Nerub can afford to lose lightly. But I believe it is absolutely worth making some sacrifices to see the Lich King destroyed, said Krivax, pleading with the High King. Not only is he an existential threat to the surface races, but also to Azrael-Nerub. Especially now that the Scourge seems to have found allies among the Vrykul. Krivax glanced toward the various important figures who had fallen quiet and were listening to him speak, hoping they would pick up on his subtle K. Fortunately, Antonidas seemed to understand that Azrael-Nerub might not be willing to carry this burden alone and was quick to offer his support. While Dalaran will remain uninhabitable for some time, this portion of Lordamere Lake still belongs to us by treaty, said Antonidas, his voice filled with authority as he spoke directly to the High King. I swear to you as Grand Magus of Dalaran that Naxxkethel will enjoy our full and unambiguous protection from anyone who might seek to exploit its vulnerability until Azrael-Nerub repairs it in full. I've received authority from Grand Magister Belovir to offer reimbursement for Azrael-Nerub's sacrifice, Sylvanas said as soon as Antonidas finished speaking. Quel'Thalas is willing to help fund a significant portion of Naxxt'l's repairs in recognition of your people's contributions. I cannot speak for anyone else, but I will personally lobby the nations of the Alliance for their assistance once this war is over, Supreme Command Lothar added, his tone solemn. It is for moments like this that the Alliance was created, and I will do everything in my power to ensure that Azrael Nerub's contributions are recognized and adequately compensated. Krivax couldn't help but feel surprised at the outpouring of support that was being expressed by everyone. A cynical part of him had expected the rest of the Alliance to just push Azrael Nerub into this commitment. Dalaran's commitment to help protect Naxxtl was particularly important as that significantly lessened the risk of their technology being compromised. This, more than any other factor, was likely the greatest source of reluctance for High King Nerubian. That the Alliance seemed so willing to offer their support filled Krivax with both relief and also pride that Azeroth had come so far in such a short time. A tense silence fell over the room as High King Nerubian slowly weighed the costs and benefits of the proposed plan to Azrael Nerub. After what felt like an eternity, the High King finally responded. Just a few short years ago, I would have immediately rejected any plan that called for Azrael Nerub to make such a sacrifice, High King Nerubian began, his deep voice echoing through the room. I had always believed in my kingdom's absolute supremacy and was confident that we could easily withstand any threat posed to us. These recent years have been more eventful and enlightening than the past millennia of my reign. Invaders from worlds beyond the stars, entities with more individual power than I can comprehend, and other equally threatening beings have all changed how I see the world. Krivax knew that other threatening beings likely referred to the old gods, and how these entities were an existential threat to Nerubians in particular. It is for these reasons that I will agree to this plan. The Lich King will be destroyed by our combined efforts, said the High King. Krivax felt the urge to cheer in celebration, but he forced this impulse back as Nerubian continued. But be warned, Azrael Nerub will expect the surface races to adhere to their vows. A quick round of affirmations immediately followed the High King's declaration, along with a sense of purpose and determination now that a clear path had been established. As their plans were settled and Krivax exited the Temple of Five Dawns to carry out his part, he also felt a sense of finality. If everything went according to plan, then the Lich King would likely be dead far sooner than anyone had ever imagined. Krivax could only hope that the inevitable sacrifices required to make that happen wouldn't be too great. Strangely enough, Gul'dan couldn't remember any point in his life when he felt as calm as he currently did. From the moment he had been born as a worthless cripple in a small village along the northern coast of Gorgrond, Gul'dan had known that he was destined for more than had been given to him. Every hint of power that he had ever gained was fought for with a relentless determination, driven by the knowledge that he was destined to reshape the foul world he had been born in. Creatures like Tichondrius, who had lived for eons and always known power, could never understand what it felt like to be truly and utterly desperate. Perhaps this was the reason why Gul'dan felt calm while the dreadlords who considered themselves his jailers were frantic as all of the Scourge's plans seemed to fall apart. Gul'dan knew that the demons blamed him for all of the Scourge's recent failures, but the dreadlords always failed to see their own faults. It was indeed Gul'dan's decision to attack Dalaran that brought them to this moment, but it was Tichondrius' weakness and hesitancy that prevented him from simply flattening the city with Shenzhen Su once the Scourge began its assault. Had Gul'dan done as he pleased, the Alliance's reinforcements would have never arrived before the Scourge finished slaughtering every pitiful fool defending that city. Then Gul'dan could have turned their corpses into his servants and turned them against their former allies. It would have been glorious, but instead the Scourge was left in disarray as the Alliance pushed them into a corner. Even as Tichondrius swore that he killed the only mage among the enemy forces capable of slaying Shenzhen Su, the dreadlord still paced back and forth in poorly concealed trepidation. Too many things had gone wrong for the demons to feel secure, regardless of how favorable their situation currently seemed. Tichondrius seemed utterly convinced that something would happen to prevent the Scourge's victory. Meanwhile, Gul'dan remained calm. Not because he disagreed with the dreadlord's assessment, but because Gul'dan was certain that this challenge was simply another step in his path to ultimate power. As far as he was concerned, every single member of the Alliance attempting to prevent the inevitable was simply a future servant waiting to join his scourge. How much longer until this worthless creature finally escapes its prison? Tichondrius asked, his irritating voice pulling Gul'dan from his thoughts. Gul'dan turned his attention from the battlefield to Tichondrius, who was currently glaring impatiently at his icy prison. The Dreadlord had clearly seen better days, with one of his wings having been torn clean off and a single horn missing from his forehead. His eyes carried a sort of frantic energy that had been steadily growing as each of the demon's kin were cut down one after another and all of his plans continued to fail. Tichondrius had chosen to relocate himself to the same room where Gul'dan's icy prison was located, which was naturally the most secure part of his fortress. The Dreadlord would normally have kept his distance, rightfully assuming that Gul'dan would betray him at the first opportunity. However, the demon had been injured severely by the mortals and likely believed that there was little chance of conflict while they both held a mutual enemy. How pathetic. I'll enjoy finally doing away with the short-sighted fool, Gul'dan thought to himself, wishing he still possessed a body so that he could sneer with disdain. Well, answer me. Tichondrius demanded, annoyed after being ignored for so long. It was not yet the right moment for them to fall into conflict, so Gul'dan decided to answer the demon's question. As I informed you when you asked mere minutes ago, it shall still be a few more hours before Shenzhen Su escapes. The loss of his limb has severely hampered his movements and I cannot consistently empower the creature with these constant interruptions. Cease your whining, Gul'dan, Tichondrius immediately responded, glaring at him even as the demon continued his anxious pacing. Your surveillance abilities are too important not to utilize. Those damnable mortals are planning something. I can feel it. Sweep the battlefield, and ensure that nothing is amiss. Gul'dan would have rolled his eyes if he could, but did as he was commanded. The abilities granted to him by the artifacts that housed his soul not only gifted Gul'dan with immense power over death and greatly expanded his mental abilities, but he'd also learned how to see through the eyes of any creature under his control. It would take but a few moments to get a full assessment over the battlefield more clear than the best scrying magic could provide. With a flex of his will, Gul'dan's mind expanded beyond the confines of his icy prison as he rapidly assumed control over his undead, assessed the state of their surroundings, and immediately moved on to the next undead. Much to Gul'dan's annoyance, Tichondrius' paranoia was very quickly proven to be warranted once he seized control over one of the cloud serpents fighting against the Alliance's aerial forces. That strange flying fortress of theirs is moving, Gul'dan telepathically reported to Tichondrius, causing the Dreadlord to immediately begin scrying said structure. I doubt that has been the case for long. If it had been, you would have noticed or Varimathras would have informed you. Tichondrius barely paid Gul'dan any mind as opened a telepathic channel with his fellow demon and studied the flying fortress with a shrewd gaze, attempting to decipher the enemy's plan. It wasn't long before Gul'dan noticed Varimathras redirecting his attention from his aerial battle to harassing the Alliance forces' ground troops. Gul'dan was no general, but Tichondrius' thinking was simple enough that even he could understand it. Without the fortress there to protect the Alliance, they were in a far more vulnerable position and the Scourge could potentially deal with the creature trapping Shenzhen Su. After studying the front lines of the battlefield for a while longer, Gul'dan felt like this was a good strategy. The Alliance had deployed a large number of reinforcements before beginning to move their fortress, but Gul'dan could already see that the enemy wouldn't last without a steady stream of new fighters. Nonetheless, Tichondrius didn't seem at all pleased by the enemy's seemingly foolish tactical decision, and his expression grew increasingly grim with every passing moment. Unable to contain his curiosity, Gul'dan decided to confront the Dreadlord directly. What is the problem, demon? Should you not be pleased that the enemy realizes the hopelessness of their circumstances and is attempting to save their greatest asset? I would be, if those were truly their intentions, Tichondrius responded, seemingly too distracted by his thoughts to insult Gul'dan as he normally would when asked a question. But there are no signs of the Alliance forces opening any portals large enough to escape from their current position, nor have the Council of Six exited the Temple of Five Dawns. I would have expected some manner of reaction by now, but there's nothing. Gul'dan would be the first to call the Dreadlord weak and overly cautious, but even he couldn't deny that something strange was happening. For the next 20 minutes, Tichondrius' agitation grew as the Alliance's fortress slowly flew across the sky along a path that brought it to a position closer to the front of Shenzhen Su. It was a shame that the Scourge lacked the means to properly destroy the structure, but any undead that approached it was promptly torn apart by its cannons or gunfire from the soldiers crawling along its sides. Still, Gul'dan couldn't see what the enemy could hope to accomplish with their current actions. The Alliance would have to reveal its plan soon if it didn't want its ground forces to be completely overwhelmed. Gul'dan watched closely as the structure slowly flew above Shenzhen Su's head and grew increasingly confused as it slowly began to descend, though not close enough that it was within the creature's range of attack. That confusion reached its peak as Gul'dan noticed the violet glow of arcane magic spreading across its base. Gul'dan had no idea what he was looking at, but Tichondrius seemed to realize the enemy's plan after a few moments of examination. Gul'dan, move Shenzhen Su's head from beneath the enemy's necropolis at once. Tichondrius barked, his voice filled with more panic than Gul'dan had ever heard from the demon. Unfortunately, Tichondrius' warning came far too late. The Alliance's fortress suddenly began falling from the skies like a meteor moments after the demon finished speaking. Gul'dan frantically attempted to move Shenzhen Su out of the way, but the creature's head was far too heavy and the massive structure fell far too quickly. Gul'dan was forced to impotently watch the necropolis descent and the cataclysmic impact that followed. The structure collided with Shenzhen Su so hard that it caused the ground beneath the creature to crack and shatter, a deafening explosion echoing across Lordamere Lake. Shenzhen Su's skull stood no chance against the immense force that fell on top of it and was immediately crushed under the fortress weight. A massive cloud of dust flew into the air as the creature's head was smashed into the ground and its body shook hard enough that both the Scourge and Alliance's forces were staggered by the tremors. Gul'dan could only stare as the cloud of dust slowly dissipated and the aftermath of the Alliance's devastating attack gradually became visible. He had already felt his connection to Shenzhen Su disappear immediately after the impact, but the magnitude of the destruction was beyond Gul'dan's expectations. The Alliance's fortress had smashed through the Shenzhen Su skull and was currently nestled neatly in the creature's decaying brain matter, with most of its physical and magical defenses active. Worse yet, Nerubians were spilling out of the structure and racing up Shenzhen Su's neck toward Gul'dan's fortress as quickly as they could, hundreds of them weaving a road made of silk as they advanced. The Scourge's forces were far too out of position to stop the Alliance's surprise attack from this unexpected vector, and it likely wouldn't arrive until the enemy were frighteningly close to his fortress. Gul'dan turned his attention to the other front of the battle and saw that there were no good signs there either. Now that the Keeper no longer needed to keep Shenzhen Su contained, he was single-handedly reversing all the progress made by the Scourge as he buried countless waves of undead under the earth. He could tell from Tichondrius' utter silence that the demon was also shaken by what had happened, frantically scrying and searching for some way to turn back the tides. However, Gul'dan had no intention of allowing the Dreadlord the opportunity to fix his failures. It was clear to him that Tichondrius had outlived his usefulness and no amount of Dreadlord trickery would extricate them from this situation. With Tichondrius distracted, injured, and still surprised by the Alliance's unorthodox tactic, it was now the perfect moment for Gul'dan to launch the plan he'd been working on since he'd been sent to Azeroth. To his credit, Tichondrius only hesitated for a few moments after one of the Scourge's most powerful mages erected an anti-spatial magic ward around the room and undead began streaming in. Those few moments were enough to seal the demon's fate as Tichondrius failed to escape before being completely surrounded by undead. There were two main reasons why Gul'dan had never been able to overcome his jailers before this moment. The Dreadlords had meticulously planned their defenses against him, and he needed to worry about Burning Legion retaliation. The Dreadlords were never all within his reach at any given moment and were always vigilant, ensuring that Gul'dan could not exploit a single moment of weakness. He could have launched an ambush before, but it would have never been successful if Tichondrius was not both injured and preoccupied. But this ambush was successful, and Tichondrius was slowly dragged through the ruined room toward Gul'dan's icy prison after destroying several dozen of his most powerful undead. "What is the meaning of this, you fool?" Tichondrius shouted as he was dragged across the floor by an undead Naga, his body covered in wounds and his last remaining wing lying on the other side of the room. "Even someone like you must understand that I am the only one who can plan a strategy that will overcome the Alliance. Without me, you're nothing but an incompetent husk stuck within a block of ice. This senseless betrayal will cost you everything." Gul'dan paid no heed to the demon's bellowing, and instead focused all of his power on the ice that kept him contained. It had taken him constant effort since the moment he arrived on Azeroth to slowly weaken his prison in preparation for this moment. Kil'jaeden had done well when he created it, and Gul'dan hadn't made nearly enough progress to escape completely, but he had managed enough to enact the next phase of his plan. Tichondrius fell into horrified silence as the sound of cracking echoed throughout the chamber and Frostmourne was slowly pushed from the ice and clattered on the floor. "Your problem, Tichondrius, is that you care too much about your clever little strategies and believe your quick mind makes you untouchable," Gul'dan said with cold triumph as one of his undead took hold of Frostmourne and pressed it into the Dreadlord's hands. "The time for subtlety is over, and the time for me to fulfill my destiny has arrived. Be grateful that you are allowed the opportunity to take part in it."